Good morning, everyone. Good morning from the UK and good evening, Australia. Today, we'll be discussing the Australian budget, and we have three excellent speakers. Bronwyn Curtis, OBE, Brendan Wren, and Richard Yetzinger. A warm welcome to Bronwyn Curtis, OBE, who will be moderating the session today. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind everybody that we have an excellent webinar coming up on Thursday, the 3rd of November. It's with the Department of International Trade, and it will be on the FTA. So we hope you'll tune into that. Good morning, Bronwyn. Bronwyn, you'll be moderating the session today, and for all of those attending, Bronwyn is a senior executive with 30 years leadership in finance, commodities, consulting and the media. She is currently chair of JP Morgan Asia Growth Income PLC and a non-executive member of the Oversight Board at the UK Office of Budget Responsibility and a non-executive director at Pershing Square Holdings, the Scottish American Investment Company PLC and BH Macro Limited. Her executive roles have included Head of Global Research at HSBC PLC, Managing Editor and Head of European Broadcast at Bloomberg, and Global Head of Foreign Exchange at Fixed Income Strategy at Deutsche Bank. She has also worked as a consultant for the World Bank and UNCTAD. Her other current appointments include Trustee of the Centre for Economic and Policy Research, the Australia-UK Chamber of Commerce, and the Times Radio MPC. Bronwyn was awarded an OBE in 2008 for her services to business economics and a Doctor of Letters in 2017 from La Trobe University in Melbourne. She's been chairman of the Society of Business Economists and is a governor of the London School of Economics. She was awarded an OBE in 2008 for her services to business. Please welcome Bronwyn Curtis.
Thank you very much, Joe. I have to say after that, God, that makes me feel old, but there we are. Look, we've got two economists today who I think you will really enjoy. Brendan Wren, who's Chief Economist for KPMG Australia and the lead partner for KPMG's economics practice. He's going to speak first and give us the nitty-gritty, and he will be followed by Richard Yetzinger, who's the chief economist and head of research at ANZ, who I actually worked with at HSBC, so we know each other well. Look, I'm not going to hold this up anymore. There is a Q&A afterwards. Both of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes and then, open it up for questions. So please come in with your questions. Exciting times, or let's say interesting times for budgets at the moment. And perhaps Australia is in a slightly better position than the UK, but clearly there are challenges. So Brendan, over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Bronwyn, and also Joanne, thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. Hi everyone, calling you from Sydney. I've just been here speaking at a client event as well, so I'm still in the hotel room, so interesting background. I might just share my screen with you. I've prepared a few slides to help make the session just that little bit easier to talk through. So the first thing to recognise is that really the first budget by the new Treasurer is really quite a modest one. He's very much kicked a lot of the issues down the road, maybe until May of next year, who knows, but certainly they haven't been dealt with in this budget. The budget shows the deficit will widen in the out years, and I should again, although I thanked him this morning, thanks Richard to the ANZ team, who I'll say I borrowed, but effectively just stole a couple of their graphs from their slide pack. So you'll see the appropriate sourcing on the bottom. But in here, you can see the dark blue lines being the most recent budget and the light blue lines being only the March budget, but very much a better position for 2023 than what was anticipated. but in fact just worsens in this budget compared to the last one, where it was in fact anticipated to get better. In financial year 22, we saw the budget budget deficit of $32 billion. Now, to put that into some context, the budget handed down only 12 months prior to that, so in May 2022, anticipated a budget deficit of just under 107 billion. So when they then did the mid-year update, the MyEFO update, they pulled that back a little bit to 99 billion, or just under 100 billion. And then in the 23 budget in May of this year, it was forecast to be just under 80 billion. So at a starting position of 106 billion and finishing at 32 billion, it's really been quite an improvement during that time period. And even just in the 6 months between budgets, a $50 billion improvement in terms of predominantly both revenue enhancement and also some spending reductions as well. In terms of the medium term though, now looking outwards, the budget's now forecast to be just under $37 billion, or 1.5% of GDP for next financial year. That's then going to increase to about 44 billion, or 1.8% of GDP in financial year 25, slightly increasing then upwards to 51 billion, and then moderating slightly back down to 49.6 billion. Now that total budget deficit over the forward estimate period totals something like about 182 billion. Again, compared to PIFO, which is the pre-election economic and financial outlook document or analysis that's prepared by the Treasury just prior to the last election, which was only in May of this year, that's nearly $43 billion better off than what was anticipated, or what's now projected in the budget compared to PIFO only 6 months previously. Now, when we try to pin down what the cause of that improvement in the budget and bottom line is, there's about $52 billion worth of improvements just from parameter variations or tightening up of assumptions, and also realignment of some expenditures and revenues. So the net impact is that 52 billion, but there's a touch over 140 billion or 144 billion in improved revenues, largely coming through personal income tax receipts and also company income tax receipts. That personal income tax receipt benefits being driven by the fact that there are more Australians working than ever has been the case, and therefore there's more Australians paying income tax than ever's been the case. Company income tax have been buoyed very much within the agricultural and mining sectors, where commodity prices have held up and has allowed substantial profits to be achieved within that sector, which is also coming through in company income tax receipts. In terms of outlays, there's an increase of around $92 billion in payments over that forward estimate period as well. The two largest components of that difference of increased outlays comes from increased interest payments on Australian government debt, with interest costs rising, and also a blowout in the NDIS scheme. I'll come back to that in a moment. So in terms of the economic conditions, the budget suggests that the economy is going to be finding itself in pretty much challenging conditions from now on. Really, we're seeing a sharp global slowdown, much higher inflation, much higher interest rates, declining real wages, and there's also going to be some drag in the Australian economy due to the recent floods that we're still dealing with in Victoria. In terms of growth projections, they've been downgraded between the earlier budget this year and now what's been presented by Treasurer Chalmers. So real GDP is estimated to be 3.25% in financial year 23, dropping to 1.5% in 24, and then increasing slightly in 25, 26 to 2.25% and 2.5% respectively. Again, compared to PFO, they're about 1% less in total, 1% less each year than what was projected in PFO, and even 0.5% less than what the Treasurer released in his July ministerial statement. The decline in GDP, particularly in financial year 23, is largely as a result of a significant drop in household consumption. What we've seen is the tightening of monetary policy and the cash rate in Australia move from 0.1% in May to now be 2.6%. And our expectations is that it will rise further to 3.35%. So another 325 basis point rise increases to the first quarter of 2023. What that means is it'll eventually start to flow through to slower consumption spending. And what we'll see is consumption growth drop, which is the blue shaded area in this chart, from 6.5% growth down to only 1.25% growth. We're also seeing still quite a drop off in dwelling investment as well. The increase in interest rates, as we know globally and with central banks the world over going through a tightening cycle, fundamentally to try to curb spiralling inflation. Clearly, this issue of inflation's been at the forefront of the Treasurer, and he's been careful to make sure that any spending that's been undertaken in this new budget really doesn't stoke the inflationary fires that are already within Australia. For those that don't know, inflation for the September quarter, inflation data for the September quarter was released yesterday, with headline inflation running at about 7.3% now, an increase of 1.8% quarter on quarter. Concerningly, non-discretionary inflation, so prices growth associated with food, utilities, housing, fuel and health costs is running at 8.4%. And in fact, would have been worse if not for the fact that there were some energy subsidies being paid by Western Australia and Queensland, where electricity only increased 3.2% within the basket in CPI, and if they hadn't provided those subsidies, it would have been around 15.6%. Energy prices are still expected to be rising quite rapidly, at least another 20% over the rest of the half of 2022 and a further 30% in financial year 24. Inflation is expected to be stronger still in the December quarter with the return of the 22% fuel excise, and in the absence of any further electricity subsidies, then the full market forces of these higher electricity costs will flow their way through. So in the budget, it's expected that inflation is going to peak at around 7.75% in the December quarter. I suspect it's going to push out into the March quarter, particularly as a consequence of this flooding. And it'll still be running at 3.5% by June 2024, which is still ahead of the RBA's 2 to 3% target band. In terms of unemployment, it's currently in Australia at 3.5%. We've got a jobs to vacancy ratio of about 1 to 1, and unemployment's really sort of been stable since about mid-July. So our view is that we're really at full employment in Australia, and that the difference between the job vacancies and unemployed really relates to a skills mismatch. The budget expects employment growth to slow to only about 1.75% in financial year 23 and only 0.75% in financial year 24. That combined with the fact that we're getting a return in migration numbers, even though we're getting relatively weak but still positive employment growth, the higher growth in the labour force means that we'll see the unemployment rate trend up to around 4.5%. One of the interesting things in the budget is that the Treasurer expects a sharp pullback in Australia's terms of trade, largely driven by assumptions associated with commodity prices. So while he might be a new Treasurer, he's still doing the Rocky and Bullwinkle Act that all former Treasurers have done, and watch them pull a rabbit out of their hat by allowing very modest commodity assumptions within the budget, which really means that we're underestimating company income tax profits during the next 12 months, or while they've got these assumptions in the model or in the budget. So at the moment, we've got commodity pricings for metallurgical coal at US $270 a tonne. The budget assumes that it goes back to $130 a tonne by March 2023. Thermal coal's at $438 and it now goes back to $60. Iron ore's at $91 a tonne, goes back to $55. Oil's $108 a barrel, falls to $100, and LNG reduces from $934 to $630. Now, they are very, very sharp reductions, and even when you compare those price assumptions, they are at odds with their own Office of Chief Economist that's in the Department of Industry, that has metallurgical coal only dropping back to around $200 a tonne, and thermal coal dropping somewhere between $230 and $125 a tonne, depending on whether it's a contract or spot price. So again, we fully expect to see the terms of trade not be as sharp as here, and consequently company profits adding more than what's actually in the budget. In terms of key announcements, there's been only few, largely around helping families and meeting government election promises. So there's been a $4.7 billion increase associated with the childcare subsidy. And how that works is there's been an increase in the maximum number of people, maximum subsidy from 85 to 90%. And there's also been an increase in the top out income threshold to now $530,000 from 1 July 2023. We're also seeing the paid parental leave scheme, which is currently running at 18 weeks support, increase from financial year 24 to 20 weeks and then up to 26 weeks by financial year 27. And that's going to cost about $500 million over the forward estimates period. Some other major spending announcements include about $1.4 billion of new listings in the PBS, $2.5 billion in aged care reform, and also an additional $1.4 billion in foreign aid, largely going to the Pacific. So in terms of the next arguments, or the next conversations that the Treasurer is going to be having, it is going to be really around reform associated with receipts and payments. In terms of receipts, the tax to GDP ratio in the forward estimates really is ranging from around 22.7% to around 23.4%. We note that in financial year 24, it also includes the introduction of the stage 3 tax cuts. For those that don't know, effectively those stage 3 tax cuts abolish the 37% marginal tax rate and lowers the 32.5% tax rate to 30%, so that really anyone on taxable income between $45,000 and $200,000 only pays a 30% tax rate. If those stage 3 tax cuts were abolished, then the tax to GDP ratio would increase to about 23.8%. We've also worked out that to balance the budget, the tax to GDP ratio would need to increase to around 25.2%. And when you look at history, the maximum tax to GDP ratio is only 24.2%, which was in financial years 5 and also in financial year 6. So what that says to us is that resolving or fixing the budget deficit is not just on one side of the ledger. There definitely needs to be conversations around the expenditure or payment side of the budget. And in particular, they're going to be tricky conversations, because the single largest growth area in the budget is around the NDIS and providing assistance for people with disabilities. That part of the budget profile is increasing by 17% in real terms between financial years 23 and 26. The NDIS scheme itself, which had a cost last financial year of just under $30 billion, is now going to cost about 35.5 billion in this financial year, increasing to 51.8 billion in financial year 26. I put that into some context. The current users of the NDIS is about 535,000 Australians. And then comparing the NDIS, Medicare, which is a scheme for the whole population, has a cost of 37.3 billion in financial year 22, but is only expected to increase to just under 45 billion in 2026. So again, this issue of resolving our budget balance and also fixing a structural budget balance, which I note one of the key differences between the new government and the last government is the inclusion of only a 1.2% productivity uplift as opposed to 1.5%. But clearly the conversation needs to not only be around taxes, but also around around expenditures as well. But make no mistake, we don't actually have a form of fiscal crisis in Australia. When you compare our overall deficit positions against the G20 countries, they're not bad. And when you look at our net debt position against the G20 countries, they're still relatively modest. The issue is that they're still much higher than what our historic positions are. So really, what we're trying to resolve is making sure that our balance sheet improves in case we need to use that balance sheet firepower for some form of fiscal crisis in the future. So in summary, as a first budget, it's a solid effort. We're not in the midst of a financial crisis that requires urgent reform, and the structural budget balance shows that the deficit position is really not sustainable in the long term if we want to keep some budget balance firepower for the next crisis. The revised budget moves the deck chairs around, but really keeps the music playing. There's been much hype but little substance around policy reform, and the question is how many chairs get taken away when the music stops at the next budget in May 23. I suspect the realities of the budget have set in, that there's no magic puddings on the right-hand side of the speaker's box. And reform has to involve both revenue and expenditure measures, plus policies to grow the economy. So thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Bronwyn.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Really interesting. Actually, very nice to hear something. I know there are challenges ahead, but nice to hear something that's relatively stable and didn't upset markets as we had here in the UK. No one could forecast that. Things seem to have settled. But, you know, there are always issues in paying the bills. So I'd like to invite Richard now to tell us about how he sees it, particularly in terms of perhaps the markets and the impact that he sees. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thanks, Bronwyn, and thanks, Brendan. Maybe if I can start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from which I join, the Borragul and Camaragal peoples, and pay my respects to land, waters and community, and to their elders past, present and emerging. And in case you're wondering, no, that's not a cucumber, it is a surfboard. I do get asked that question, believe it or not. I don't know why people think it might be a cucumber. Maybe I was going to start about the fiscal side actually and the markets, Bronwyn, because of the UK's experience, of course, and economies, not really, governments have really struggled to step away from that big, broader central role they took in the economy through the pandemic. And the first thing for me on Tuesday night was, you know, thank goodness we don't have to reset the macro framework and rethink about that again. The underlying macro picture for Australia for the next year is still a variant of what you can see in most countries, which is withdrawal of what has turned out to be far too much stimulus during the pandemic, maintained for far too long, and everybody doing it at the same time. Sorry about that. We do need to, you know, refresh our work around policy spillovers and remind each other that when we're all doing the same thing, whether it's fiscal contraction after the GFC or fiscal permissiveness through the pandemic and afterwards, actually, they're liable to be spillovers and reinforce each other. And obviously, it's been a long time since we've had an inflation challenge like this. I mean, in Australia, it feels kind of like, you know, the highest since never, but it's been hard, I think, and still is, for people to really recognise, you know, why economists say inflation is such a problem. And I think, you know, as economists, if for any economists listening, Bronwyn, Brendan, I think it's worth, when we talk to people, just saying, you know, this is why we don't like inflation, because once it kind of starts to get loose, it's a pretty damn wily adversary. You're worried about over-tightening and causing a recession. You don't want to under-tighten and let it get baked in. It's obviously regressively distributive in the economy. People who spend most or all or more than all of their income on necessities are clearly hit the hardest and have less flexibility. But even for those households that have savings in Australia, your savings by 7% less in real goods and services than they did a year ago. And I commiserate with everyone dialing in from London, where the number is more like 10%. And of course, even if we put, you know, inflation in kind of macro context and think about the great challenge of our time, this climate transition, it makes that harder. The cost of materials is going up, and the transition is going to take a lot of those. But also, you know, renewable energy, for instance, is running cost light, which is its big advantage, but it's capital cost heavy. So higher rates are a problem for the capital side. So they can potentially actually make the transition more difficult. All of that maybe is a slightly long way of saying the policy tightening we're facing is painful, but I think it's far preferable to the alternative of letting inflation really get entrenched and potentially get away from us. And it's also worth reminding, actually, that the reason this tightening cycle has needed to keep going on, and the RBA is trying a bit of a pivot at the moment. The Bank of Canada overnight's trying a bit of pivot. There's a hint the Fed might try and pivot again soon. I think they need a chiropractor shortly, to be honest. Is that economies are showing fantastic resilience in the face of rate hikes, actually. You know, even this, what seems to be this inevitable recession in Europe, is taking a while to actually come through. And in Australia, the housing market is weak, no doubt. I think to some extent there's a bit of a mathematical thing going on there. You want to borrow, rates go up, the sausage mincer that the bank uses to assess how much it will lend you will bring the amount it will lend you down just because of higher rates. I think the market's adjusting for that. Last weekend, for instance, in Melbourne, the number of houses on auction worth nearly half what they were a year ago. It's a market where people are saying, I'm not under any pressure to sell, prices are lower, I don't really want to sell. So I think we can always worry about the risks of over-tightening, and we should, and central banks obviously are concerned about that as well. But I think, look, the risk of this landing becoming really horrible and really bumpy, I think actually is much lower than most people give credit for. Consumers are in very strong shape in Australia, and in fact, many advanced economies. In Australia, you might be surprised to know, everybody knows about the household debt story here, and it's still the worst in the gene pool, unfortunately. It has only deteriorated a bit the last 15 years. The 15 years before that, it was galloping away. So the rate of deterioration in gross debt has definitely slowed. But also the fastest growing part of the household balance sheet in Australia the last 15 years has been liquid assets, actually. So if you calculate a bit of a net debt measure, gross debt less liquid assets, that measure is at the best position in 15 years. And even if you look at kind of the vulnerable end of the income spectrum, the proportion of mortgages to households with less than 1 week's consumption of liquid assets has halved in about the last 10 or 15 years. So more rate hikes, yes, because inflation is primarily driven by demand, not supply. And demand is turning out to be pretty darn resilient in the face of interest rate hikes. Which is good, but of course, you know, hopefully central banks don't over tighten. When I stand back beyond the, oh goodness, you know, we're not going to import a UK problem into Australia, maybe there's three things that occur to me about this budget, because this is the first budget of a new government. We haven't seen that since 2014. Traditionally, it's a reset budget, wipe the slate clean, set your own narrative, and this government actually absolutely has done that. And it's probably done that in three ways. One is around the parameters, second thing around the narrative, and the third thing around the framework. And Brendan spoke a lot about the parameters, so I won't do much there except to say I agree. Big upward surprise Given the economy is operating at full employment, almost certainly that scale of upward surprise we won't see again. I may not see that between now and the rest of my career, to be honest. We're talking about this pandemic recovery, which has been kind of crazy. And, you know, absent the view of holy smokers, the world is just going to have this nasty global recession. I agree with Brendan that there's some conservatism built into the medium-term numbers. On the narrative, yes, the discussion is back to sustainability, but in a different sense from kind of the pre-pandemic narrative in Australia. In Australia, the pre-pandemic narrative about sustainability was surplus. Surplus, we're going for surplus, we're going for surplus kind of next year or the year after or the year after that. It was quite a short-term, more tactical sense of surplus. This time the government has spoken about sustainability really in a broader narrative of unsustainability. We've got these 5 big drags on expenditure. The change in interest payments in the National Disability Insurance Scheme have been the largest, but also just defence, and we all know the world we're living in, health, and also aged care. Demographics are pretty inexorable, even when your largest import is younger people from other countries. But even on the revenues, on the expenditure side, revenue side, 40% of revenue comes from individual income tax. That's not kind of the right mix. I do think that expenditure side is probably going to get the most focus. It's not easy kind of policy ground, but it probably, given Australia's political reality, easier than the tax side. And the last issue is kind of the framework around fiscal policy. The Treasurer introduced a wellbeing framework in this set of budget papers. Look, fiscal policy's always been about distributional issues as much as macro balance. In Australia, fiscal expenditure is about $650 billion. That's a zillion different decisions about where to spend it and who to spend it on and what to do with it and how to prioritise and whether to spend some this year or some next year. So thinking about policy in the context of wins and losses has always been part of the story, but just putting an overarching framework around the aggregates, I think, has become a bit of a trend. And look, I think it's a good thing, and it's not just helpful in the sense that governments are struggling to work out how to step away from this enhanced role they took during the pandemic, but also two of the real issues we're struggling with in Australia, one very common to everywhere, which is, you know, climate and just working through that, but also housing. You know, I think these are issues where we might get some help by putting some broader metrics around them and getting away from just the dollars and cents economics and thinking about things a little more broadly. I call it a wellbeing framework. It's more a wellbeing idea. There's a dozen pages in the document which say, hey, you know, we should look at putting a more formal, more rigorous framework around the budget around these things. It does, maybe the only formal structure is an annual statement to Parliament around climate and what the government's doing around that, which again, I think for transparency reasons is not bad. And just remember, for this Treasurer, and he's a Queenslander, and I lived in Queensland for about 10 years, so he's at least 50% a good bloke. He's only been in the job for less than 6 months. He's done a job summit. He's preparing a white paper after the job summit. He's committed to 2 budgets within 6 months and undertaking a review of the Reserve Bank of Australia. So he's definitely jumped in with both feet. Maybe for me, the summary, you could say, this is kind of a 100-page fiscal update compressed into a 700-page budget. One commentary suggested it was a no surprise budget. Look, I can't disagree with that, but that also doesn't really do it justice. I think it does reset quite a lot and changes the narrative, and I think that will become more apparent over time. Thanks very much. Back to you, Bronwyn.
Hold on. Have I unmuted myself?
You're on mute. $10 in the tin.
I think I've unmuted myself.
You're good now.
Good. Thank you. It's always someone, isn't it, that hasn't unmuted? It had to be me. You say it's a boring budget. Well, others have said it's a boring budget. I suppose for me, in this environment, in this climate where everybody spent too much money during government spent too much money during lockdown, inflation's going up, and you don't know what the impacts are going to be. I think it's probably stability is a good idea. Can I just start with one question? I'll start with Brendan. You said, you talked about the fall in household consumption. Did I get that right? From 6.5% growth down to 1.5% growth?
Yeah.
And, what impact does that have? I've been out of Australia for a while, probably like everyone, but, that seemed a big fall to me.
Yeah, it is. And it will have a substantial impact given that consumption is about 2/3 of normal GDP expenditure growth. So, sorry, 2/3 of GDP expenditures, household consumption. So what we're likely to see, or what's anticipated to see, is just households pulling back on their spending profile as interest rates start to bite. Now, when you have a look at retail sales, what's quite interesting is prior to the budget, we were, prior to the pandemic, spending something like $29 billion a month in retail sales. The last few years we've had it sort of chopping and changing and reasonable volatility in that. But over the last 12 months, it seems to have reset itself at around $32-33 billion a month and escalating. So part of this is a bit of a COVID catch-up. Part of it is that there's just extra cash in the economy because there's more people working. Part of it is that people have had more savings in the economy during COVID and are starting to spend it. I think I heard the term revenge spending, as we're able to get out of home. The likelihood is that that's going to come back as people's spending patterns reverse. There's a few less people working, and that the expectation of higher interest rates start to bite. And I'm sure Richard's got more precise numbers, but what you also saw in COVID in the last couple of years is a lot more Australians taking fixed term mortgages. So these interest rate increases that we've had already really haven't started to bite yet, because lots of households that do have mortgages, and recognising that it's roughly about a third of households have a mortgage, a third own their home, and a third rent in Australia. Sort of slightly off from that, but enough to sort of use it as a rule of thumb. So these increases in the variable mortgage rates aren't really hitting a lot of households yet, both through the combination of not everyone having a mortgage, but also having fixed rate mortgages that are now going to roll off as well. But the expectation is that it will start to come soon. And that's why you're seeing consumption growth drop over the next 12 to 18 months.
Okay, thanks very much, Brendan. Richard, I have a question for you from our Q&A, and I'll come back to Brendan because there are a couple of other things that obviously I think are more. How high do you think interest rates will go? And what will the RBA do if inflation gets out of control?
Look, I think they will do what every other central bank that has a credible inflation framework has been doing. They'll respond and they'll manage any difficulties that come with that. I think, the idea that we're facing a 1970s problem is off the scale doesn't mean it's not painful and it's not proving to be difficult. But the idea, I think, that we'll face an extended run of years where inflation just continually keeps surprising, I think is very low. Look, our latest forecast is 385, and we have revised that up quite a number of times. We began the year by saying the peak in this cycle would be above 3. We didn't know we didn't think at that stage we'd get there this year, but we also we have the view that the bank trying to slow is being premature. The data on the CPI in the last little bit suggests actually that inflation pressure in an underlying sense is much stronger than we had been thinking, and so that means we still have 100 points or so to go before the bank can stop. Maybe when I talk to people, the key thing I've been emphasising is, yes, where rates get to, absolutely, lots of you will care about and I care about, but I just wouldn't be banking on the idea that they get there and then they decline relatively quickly after that. I think there are a range of reasons why there's going to be there need to be interest rates sustained at higher levels for a reasonable period of time. And so it's, yeah, they go up, and then I think you should expect them to stay up there.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that probably interest rates had been too low for too long, frankly, even though inflation was low. You know, I just think it's created some problems. You haven't mentioned it. Nobody's mentioned it, but the currency, the Aussie dollar. I mean, it's obviously been dragged up, I'm guessing, against the rest of the world with the US dollar. And so you're not going to be importing inflation, or is it going to cause a problem? Is it stable? How do you see that feeding in? Richard, first.
Maybe the first thing I'd say is I'm glad I don't forecast the currency anymore, Bronwyn. We've both done that before, and it's a bloody pest of a job, isn't it, really? But look, in trade, you're right. In trade-weighted terms, the Aussie dollar is a bit weak, but not, you know, when we're talking about an inflation challenge where we've got core inflation above 5%, the depreciation in the trade-weighted index is not the thing that's really changing the story on inflation. I think that's probably my view. Brendan, any difference?
No, I don't. No, I don't think so. I mean, the challenge is what we've seen globally is just the flight of currency to the US. I mean, it's just the strength of the US dollar. So even if you look at that trade-weighted index and take the US out, we're still pretty similar to the pound, euro, yuan. Yeah,
that's great. Now, I have one on the NDIS spending. Is there a serious policy discussion occurring about making this sustainable, is the question.
Apparently, but it's going to be, so there's an NDIS review going on, but it is going to be an absolutely awful, poisoned conversation to have around trying to pull the expenditures back. Because what we've now got is expectations built into the community around levels of support. And there's real challenges now going to be, how do you pare that back to a more fiscally sustainable position when you're looking at the NDIS that's costing more than Medicare for less than 1 million people? And the hard thing then becomes around having conversations about taking things away from the most vulnerable people in the community who have already got or starting to get some levels of support they haven't had a decade ago. But you know, there are conversations, or there are conversations about making sure that there's tighter access to the NDIS, that there's no bad actors in society that are taking or fraudulently taking the funds. That's all tricky. That's really tricky stuff. But the headline is that it's about, are we as a society prepared to continue to pay for it?
It does seem a lot of money for a few people. I mean, I'm not.
That's huge. It's huge, and but the problem is that the few people, they're the most vulnerable in community, and they're and so it then becomes a very targeted conversation about taking something away from these people.
Yeah, and that's always difficult. It's a bit like the National Health Service in the UK. It's creaking. It costs an absolute fortune. I mean, I don't think NDIS is creaking, but it's impossible to reform it or take it away. So I think that's going to be a very, very difficult conversation. Where might they do something? Clearly, they try and catch up with those who are exploiting the situation.
Yeah, that's what they really need to do. Is they need to go through and have a much better auditing process, I suspect, in terms of who's accessing the system and who's getting what money. How much of the $30 billion is being exploited fraudulently? I don't know. I don't know how much of that, relates to people accessing funds who really shouldn't be getting those monies at all. But again, the policy context and the policy frameworks now, and it's not just in Australia, it's the world over, you cannot talk about winners and losers. There just has to be winners and people that are kept whole or kept constant. The challenge here, though, is to pare back on that. You're going to have to create losers, and that's just political poison.
Yeah, no, that's a real problem. Richard, you mentioned something which and it's come up in our questions in the Q&A actually, because I was going to ask it too. If 40% of revenue is sourced from personal taxes, so does this mean the government is more likely to keep to the stage 3 tax cuts to the top marginal rate? How will this be received by the general public, particularly those struggling to meet rising costs of living?
It did dominate the airwaves here for a few weeks, and I usually, to be honest, Bronwyn, try and duck these questions. The answer is I have no idea. I mean, it's become one of those kind of almost a new third rail of kind of politics here, where it seems to be just because they're in the numbers, it's become quite difficult to move them. You would think, though, in a general sense, this government is going to be moving to find more expenditure rather than less. So if the stage 3 tax cuts stay because they're legislated, then they'll be working extra hard to find some, a few extra pennies somewhere else.
Yeah, just a question. I'm not sure whether it's you or Brendan, just occurred to me. I mean, things like migration are a big issue in lots of places. Canada is taking in more than Australia at the moment, and you've got full employment. Will those numbers increase? Can you get, I mean, you need younger people to pay for all of this Medicare and NDIS and so on. What's happening around migration?
So the government announced that it was taking an extra, is it 40 or 50,000, Richard? I can't remember, but now 235,000 is the net migration cap for the next 2 years. And it's coming back pretty quickly, back to basically pre-COVID levels, and levels of migration are coming back faster than what was anticipated. They weren't, basically those levels are now what they thought was going to happen in 2025. The point, though, to recognise is that the world's woken up. It's not just Australia that, we've sort of been doing this, but the world's woken up on the benefits associated with skilled migration. They average down the age of the taxpayers. They come in highly educated at a point in their lives that don't cost us anything. And you get a young skilled migrant in their early 20s or mid 20s, you get another 40 years worth of tax benefits out of them before they start costing you too much in terms of higher healthcare costs, aged care, and by that stage there won't be any pension costs. We'll have superannuation. But they are skilled migrants, are manna from heaven, absolutely. But Australia has now got a much more competitive global landscape in terms of attracting those people.
Yes,
I think Brendan finishes on a fantastic point. Sorry to interrupt, Bronwyn. That unfortunately the debate in Australia became quite myopic of, we've done well with COVID, so we're the golden child, everyone will want to come. But of course, every global city is looking for IT and compliance and lawyers and, business consultants and all these things. There are a few Australians who still want to spend some time in London and other places, Singapore. So that's one challenge, I think, or one piece that was missing. The other piece is, where are we going to put these people? Because like everywhere during the pandemic in wealthy economies, we want more space at home. So the headship rate has gone down. The number of people on average per dwelling has gone down over the pandemic. So there's a dwelling shortage. You can't get on any social media platform in Australia anymore without seeing young people saying, I'm from Brazil, I need a place to stay, I'm losing my house next week, etc., etc. And yet we're going to ramp up immigration. And it's not just about supply. There's, that's kind of an economic argument. Oh, well, if I can't fix demand, I'll just change supply. Try building a dwelling in Australia. It costs a few bob, let me tell you. And that's if you can get someone to do it. So
yeah,
let's see. I mean, if we were assessing fiscal policy on the basis of does it add to the inflation challenge, we probably just need to think a bit more carefully about immigration as well.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong, Richard. I'm going through that process at the moment. From I think my first quote in September last year to signing a contract in February went up 23%.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's gone up here as well, but and those sorts of levels. But I think it probably goes up more because if you're short of labour, which you're obviously short of labour, it's going to get worse. We didn't actually. I have to tell you, my daughter, who her and her family are in Amsterdam, and they're both in the energy sector, and they've applied to emigrate to. Well, she has an Australian passport, of course, but emigrate to Melbourne. 2 small children, good working age, sort of thing. I nearly had a heart attack. I'm thinking, oh my God, I'll be on that plane even more. Sorry, house prices then. House prices. We didn't mention house prices, and that's always something that Australians love to talk about.
Well, they're going down. The challenge, the challenge with house prices and obviously interest rates are the dominant factor that's driving house prices down at the moment. But there are also the thing to always recognise, and Richard knows this, is that there's always self-correcting mechanisms in the house price market, or the housing market. That means that prices don't collapse too much at any one point in time. So what we're seeing, and Richard's already made the point before, increasing demand with no supply. And so supplies dropped and will continue to drop, particularly as you're not getting large development occurring, large apartments, all those sorts of things. So we expected price drops, I think, of about 17% by the middle of next year from a peak, maybe a touch less than that.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. We're running out of time here. I have a couple of online questions, and I've got one more because I want to ask about the impact of China slowdown, but I'll do that last. Do either of the speakers believe the measures announced for the vocational education training will seriously address the skills shortage?
No, I don't. Look, I don't think so. They don't seem substantial enough in scale. But I think what has changed, Bronwyn, is the pre-pandemic period really governed, like in many places, by this insufficient demand story. And so that really strangled reform, because if you're a business facing, struggling to find customers, struggling to keep your margins, if you're a consumer that's worried about your job security, struggling with wages, when a government says, let's reform and move lots of stuff around, you kind of go like, eek, it's going to probably exacerbate all those problems in the short term. Now the problem is insufficient supply. All of a sudden it is about skills. Very clearly, building skills is a win-win. There is no loser from that. Even the discussion around childcare has changed. It's lesser, well, in fact, it's no longer discussed as kind of a women's policy or a family policy, but discussed as an economic policy. It's about increasing labour supply, getting the best people into the labour market. So no, I don't think there's enough going on skills, but I think people really recognise the scale of the challenge now, and I think this will be the beginning of a much bigger push.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that this conversation around reskilling people for the new economy is actually going to become much more important going forward, because they need to retrain people who have gone through the higher education sector that weren't really fit for purpose for the old economy, need to be retrained to be fit for purpose for the new economy.
Okay, so it is happening. Now, I've got one more quick question, which I've got to address. What can we expect from the budget next May? Any change, more of the same?
Look, I do expect the budget to be more fulsome. I think that there's going to be a lot of effort put in over the next 6 months. Again, it's going to be some revenue measures, but there needs to be bigger conversations around expenditure as well. The challenge is going to be about where they get or how they address the revenue mix in Australia. There's too much dependency on income taxes at a individual and a company level, and you know, we did the Henry Tax Review and the tax white paper. It's a no-brainer with regards to changing to a more efficient tax base. The challenge is the political suicide associated with it.
You mean higher? I call it VAT, but VAT.
Yes.
GST. GST. Okay. Quick one before because I still want to do China. Australia's push into renewables seems to be slower. Any new incentives introduced in this budget?
Nothing in the budget, but look, I don't want to defend Australia necessarily. Maybe I'll just say Australia is a fossil fuel exporter. The debate here was always going to be more fractious, and that's just the reality. I think there's also kind of a lesson. You think about, hard to believe, 7 years ago, that little Brexit vote, remember that little surprise that, you know, was actually the beginning of quite a shift in the approach to trade liberalisation around the world. You know, the US became more protectionist, more countries. It was just the first little inkling of changes that had been occurring under the surface for a while. Why has that happened? Because we had this great multi-decade trade liberalisation story. The winners did really well, and we said to the communities that were losing, well, you just need to adjust. And what the evidence says is they don't adjust. Lower lifetime income, lower lifetime job tenure, higher rates of alcohol abuse, higher rates of premature death to illicit drugs, all sorts of, you know, these are really serious issues. So I think kind of for the world, and particularly for economies that are very split like Australia, listening to the squeaky wheels, making sure we take the communities along that are going to be negatively impacted, is going to give us the best chance of sustaining this for the next few decades, which is what we have to do. It's not a 1 or 2 year win, but it's a multi-decade win. I think Australia's on that path now.
Okay, we're nearly out of time. Just China quickly. China slowdown, not been mentioned. Clearly, the budget's suggesting that commodity prices are going to come off a bit more than you think. So, you know, impact in about 30 seconds. Brendan?
Oh, sorry, I thought Richard was speaking.
Doesn't matter. I don't mind.
Look, I think it's around iron ore sales. It's going to be a challenge if steel production drops because the real estate sector in China continues to tank. I think Richard would probably be a much better place to understand, you know, how much more severe that's going to get. I mean, from an outsider looking in, it looks reasonably dire. There's a lack of buyer confidence. Asking for moratoriums on mortgage payments, that's just going to make the funding cycle even harder for real estate firms or real estate developers, whether the Chinese government then steps in like it normally does and does infrastructure spending and therefore pushes up iron ore demand. I'm not sure.
Richard?
Look, it's worth remembering on this, I think, that the things Australia exports to China, I mean, now that the pandemic kind of reset the baseline on students and reset the baseline on tourism, almost everything else Australia exports to China happens to sit on big ships, be traded at global prices and be really fungible between economies. Coal exports to China went like that. Coal exports to Indonesia went like that. I don't think Australia is excessively exposed to a China slowdown. The world is exposed. I think that's the reality. China has been the epicenter of global growth since the global financial crisis. I mean, the German export machine wouldn't be half of what it is with this great China growth story. The reality is the Chinese population is shrinking now. We haven't seen this sort of demographic transition in peacetime for any meaningfully sized economy ever before. The world needs to get used to China growing at 2 or 3, not 6 or 7. And I think we can kind of pencil those numbers in for the foreseeable future. It's still a $15 trillion economy. if you're trying to sell childcare or education into China, it's probably not a great market for you. Maybe Vietnam's a better opportunity. But if you're selling retirement services or aged care, China's going to have lots of business. So I just think the nature of the sort of trade and the business opportunities in China are changing, I think, quite quickly, actually.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brendan. Richard, I think we have to come to the end of this Q&A and this session. Really appreciate you giving your time up. I'm sure you're quite busy at this period, so much appreciated. Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I'm handing back to Joe or whether I'm just saying goodbye to everyone. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bronwyn.
Thank you. Bye.